First Presbyterian Church and the Reformed Church banded together and started the YMCA. And that went pretty big, yeah. So there's a history down here of looking after people. And that's a nice side to a historic district, that it's not just the homes, it's taking care of your people. There were schools for slaves even starting down here for women when women didn't get educated. So people took care of each other, looked out for them.
Yeah.
That should always be a major part of any preservation.
Well, no, I guess that's the 50-cent tour. I guess we gone through it all. So, yeah, good input.
Wealth of information.
Good input, I hope. Yeah, that you can
Your kids are very
put that together.
We'll teach you.
I love homeschooling. It's good. I was thinking it too. Well, he was talking about 14 North Ferry, 468. There was a candle factory there, and there was soap making company. How neat it would be if we had a little soap business and a little candle business, and
love that.
And even if it was a part of someone's home where you could just put one room dedicated to candles or to soap or to a dressmakers or a grocery store. 14 North Ferry was a grocery store in the front. They also held court there. Judge DeGraff was in charge of court.
There was a stable next door.
And there was
livery stable. Yeah.
And one over at Karen Johnson's.
Yeah, and there was also on the...
There were theaters around.
Yep.
It'd be so nice if we could have that.
I mean, I already love the neighborhood, but yet that would make it just so special to have.
It'd be so intriguing. And maybe you wouldn't make a lot of money at businesses like that, but you'd have the community.
Well, my husband is a shoemaker by trade, and we are trying to get business loans to open his own.
Oh, that's cool. That's cool.
A shoemaker back in the neighborhood.
That's cool. We'll tell him about Frank the shoemaker then.
Yeah, he's
and then there's got to be, if you go to the city and you look at those indexes and photos. When I was there, I spent a lot of time looking, not only just the Union Street corridor one, but for Ferry and Liberty. And there's some photos, but I don't remember if there were, particularly ones of the shoemaker shop and Mr. Vogel and Leo the butcher, and I think there might have been a couple of Krugers, but it was really interesting.
There's a butcher's shop.
Really interesting.
I think it was Rob Petito's house. At one time was a butcher shop, I think, that my family had lived there and run. So it was all
that was
up and down
the Nicholas
Right.
family, which was on.
And there were real estate businesses and all sorts of things. It was full.
It perplexes me that they're against business in this neighborhood.
And if you can't get there by car, so what? You walk. Park up in the lot and walk down the street and let the people who live here get to them.
Yeah, because that's everybody's big complaint with business here is the parking. But
if they just took the signs off the street and let us figure it out ourselves, we'd be okay. And I understand move in the snow, but the rest, let us figure it out.
Yeah, Friday nights down here, I turn the corner when I'm coming home from work, and it's like, oh no. You got all the bars here. There are people on both sides.
Bars a lot loud and nothing else.
Both sides of the street, and I'm thinking, and then right through to 11 o'clock at night. Yeah. And then after 11, they're still walking the streets down here.
It was funny, 2 days ago. The doorbell rang, and I had been painting, just covered with paint all over because they're my paint clothes, plus some that I slapped on that day. And so I answered the door, and there's a guy there, and he said, I have a 2 o'clock appointment with you. And I said, no, you don't. And he said, yes, I do. And he tried to come in, and he wanted to meet with me. He was convinced I was his lawyer.
Sam, you're all set.
I looked nothing like a lawyer. It was across the street.
How are we doing, Sammy?
The poor guy was desperate. That's so funny. It was funny.
We heard his zip line story.
Oh, did you? But that was pretty traumatic. I believe in fun, but not head cracking.
We're all done. Well,
I think there's been a lot of neat stuff down here that's happened because people were allowed to. And we put it 2 times now.
Right. Yeah.
And pendulum has to swing back the other way.
Yeah.
And let
I
people.
mean, it's good that there's restrictions on what you can do and then on preservation, but you're right. There's got to be
There's got to be a little more room because there are too many people who need to let out what's inside. They need to make their shoes. You know, there needs to be people. For free.
Charlie, come over and stand. You're not going to be in the video.
And 3 of his relatives had defected from the German army, and they came here, and one of them came and they defected here, and then their families were in danger, and the Germans were trying to get from Germany, getting those who were already here to spy for them in the First World War and commit espionage. So a lot of the downtown buildings that had German wording in the concrete had to be parched over and obliterated to keep the family safe. And half the church records were destroyed. And then, so a lot of the German history was gone. First World War, not second. Is that incredible? I think it's something else.
I'm rolling on all this, so you guys just, I got to change the restroom, but
Okay.
I am rolling, you guys can continue.
Oh, okay. So we're filming now, then. So okay.
Absolutely.
Just to,
I'm working on a quiz, and you say interesting thing in this section, we'll probably take that and use it.
Make sure you say only interesting things.
right. Oh, our family, the Schneiderwinds, came here in 1842, and there were several families that came from Hille, Germany at that time. Nikolaus family, Nikolaus's restaurant that was on the corner of State and Erie Boulevard. Debbie's family was Nikolaus, and they also had a butcher shop that was down across from the Indian, near Arthur's. And then they were also the Schwenker family and the Whitmire, the broom factory. So they were also German families that came from Hille, Germany about the same time and came here to Schenectady. As early as my great-great-grandfather having a broom shop over on Knott Street, 17 Knott Street. When they first came here, there were family members that worked there. And
that's the land that's now Alpha.
they made brooms, yeah, and it's the land that was American Locomotive. There were several buildings there on Lower Knott Street. There are other families that were even we had one of our family members, Louisa. She was married to a Whitmire. She was a daughter to William Schneiderwind, who was my great-great-grandfather, the broom maker. And and as time went on, our family, my father worked for American Locomotive here in Schenectady. Grandfather worked for GE. Dad graduated from Union College in 1935 and went to Union College, went to Alco. He was in payroll. My grandfather was a machinist, and even times at the war, they kind of bounced back and forth. My grandfather did. He went to work for Alco, and then again back to GE as a machinist. They're at our house that we presently live in was built in 1870. It was built by Hiram Ingersoll. He was a sheriff. He was first sheriff of Schenectady. So he lived in this house, occupied this house, and my great uncle.
His son George started the waterworks.
George did? Yes, he was. Yeah, he was the first commissioner of water, and for the city of Schenectady. And again, the Ingersoll house that's now up on State and Balltown, that was originally his residence. He didn't build it, but he did own that house at one time. And also Dr. Carmichael, he was my great uncle. He was a practicing dentist here in the city. He started his business on the corner of Union and Ferry in 1878 and continued right through the 40s, actually. If you wanted to have your teeth pulled, you could pay 50 cents, get your tooth pulled, and if you wanted Novocaine, it would cost you $1. So then he was kind of the painless dentist of the time. And also there were at that time there were several doctors, and Doctors Row here, and even as far back as an earlier period of 1878, there was Dr. Duane, Dr. Jones, and Ferry Street, the corner of Ferry and Union here was like a little strip mall. There was the doctors, there was also a dress shop, there was cigar shop, and small and small little shops along that section of Ferry Street. Stickles store, of course, being on the corner, which predated the construction of these Victorian homes, and that was Pop Stickles. It was also during the Revolutionary period. We're going back to 1767, when Finn and Ellis occupied the site where our house is built here at 203, and they were here for a period of 7 years with a fur trading business. 205 Union, which is now bed and breakfast, the English Gardens. My grandmother had a rooming house there at 205, and that was Mrs. Jones. She ran rooming house in the 40s and 50s, and which was I spent most of my childhood there at that house. My mother had a beauty shop on Ferry Street, so everything was nice and close, and it was very, very good. Then the period, then the turn of the century, most of the residents or the buildings that were on Ferry Street, it was just a small community. There was everything from Leo the Butcher to the Frank the Shoemaker, Unita Cleaners, there was Kruger's, the store, the newsstand, Mr. Vogel's, and Pat's Grill, and it was just a small little community. You didn't have to go very far to do your shopping and to interact with people and so on. My mother's beauty shop, the Glamor Beauty Shop, Mom had a shop there for quite a few years. And there was, because of the Riverside School, of course, the elementary school. It was there were a lot of families, not only from the lower section of Front Street, but through the Stockade. There were a lot of families with children, and that went to Riverside School. Mm-hmm. And there were a lot of things that we interacted with. Great friends with the Weinheimer boys, Matthew and Kurt and Mark, and we had our own little times of sword fighting with wooden and garbage can tops for shields and little swords.
How'd you make your accent?
Jousting matches, and occasionally we would split a piece of green wood and with some twine and a piece of slate and make a hatchet, or some type of axe, and that was the days of the Vikings, and that was a little dangerous at times. But we always had a lot of fun playing and things like that. And of course, when the ice came out in the river, that was another adventure to climb on these huge 6-8 foot chunks of ice that floated up on the banks of the park.
And did you ever go swimming?
The Riverside, of course, had the pool. That was a great pool in the park. It was very, very a nice park. You know, we again.
Was there a bathhouse there?
The pool just disappeared in the early 70s. I came home from college one time, walked down to the park in the 70s, and the pool was gone.
But was it a big park?
And
big pool?
it was a very nice pool. It was and it was a lot of fun, and there were a lot of kids that that utilized the pool.
You went to get the candy where?
Right, and then there was, at the end of Ingersoll, there was a small little wood frame building, and it was just a small little store, kind of dimly lighted. You could go in and get a True Aid or a Knee High or something like that. It was just or popsicle, creamsicle, and it was a nice little store. It was just something small, and I don't know how many people know about that.
Remember when Mrs. DeRisi, who lived up in North Berry, said Harold always knew just how to do things.
Right.
And get his own way. What she meant is he was bratty.
Yeah.
But she's the one who had lived in the house with the jail.
Yeah, Helen and Chris DeRisi, they restored the house on Ferry, and it was at one time it served as a jail for a very early period when the courthouse was actually at Goodrich House on the corner.
It was before that.
Which was the H.S. Barney residence.
After 1795 and before 1809.
Somewhere's in that time frame.
During those years.
Right. Mm-hmm.
And then it sat empty for a lot of years.
That's right.
Then Chris DeRisi restored the house and turned it into a home instead of a jail.
Yeah, well, it was. Yeah, he had done a lot of work to the house. They were there, they did that work in the 1960s. Yeah, when Chris worked for American Locomotive, my father. So
there were some ladies down on Green Street, who were friends with your mother. Who were those ladies?
I don't know.
You don't remember?
No.
Mrs. Shanklin. What about Mrs. Shanklin?
Mrs. Shanklin has she lived in the Joseph Yates house, which was, of course, reputedly one of the oldest houses in the city, adjacent to the Dutch Reformed Church. And she was quite a lady. She was another one that was a true Schenectadian or Stockadian. And she was very, Lavinia was very interesting to talk to. I did several things. Even as a child, I did illustrations of the elevation of the house and floor plans, and we sat and talked, and we walked through, and it was a small booklet put out when I was in elementary school at Riverside, 6 Belts of Wampum. So that book is probably still at the Historical Society. I'm sure there's a copy of it and there were several students at age 10 to 12 that did some little sketches and illustrations. I happened to do her house in the First Presbyterian Church.
So her grandfather lived next door?
That was the grandfather. That was the Shanklin home. That's right. And she was born in that house. In fact, even at the time that they were cleaning the house out, and when she was still alive, she had just things from her childhood, her baby carriage, and different things that were still in the house up in the attic. So she had spent her childhood days there.
And her parents as well.
That's correct. Yep. And I guess as the 50s and 60s here in the Stockade, again, our own little community, and Ferry Street being like a little strip mall, those businesses after 1970 seemed to disappear. The butcher shop, there was an extreme fire in the southeast corner of Union and Ferry, which the building burnt to the ground in 1959. Shortly after that period of around 1961, there was the, which is now an attorney's office. That was the building, different type architecture was built. So it's kind of, as we go down and look at the facade along Union Street and see a building that was basically a contemporary looking building in a historic district. It was something that at that time, I guess we were not so, I guess, in tune to things of the district trying to preserve, and I'm sure at that time a lot would even stayed vacant or built something of the same character of the other buildings in the facade. So, yeah, there was, I can remember quite well, and my grandmother woke me up. At that time I was 7, so I can remember the fire, an intense fire, and there was someone that perished in the fire. I think it was one gentleman, and then there was a woman that night that came over, wrapped in a fur coat, all singed, and spent the night with us because of fire and losing belongings and everything. And it was a tremendous fire. And during the time of, it was in the winter, so it was probably February, March or something, very cold, and of course just the water iced up as much as the firemen were trying to put the fire out. It was in a very extremely cold night. So, and then it just seems that our area here has changed quite a bit. The bed and breakfast next door, when my grandmother had a rooming house, the English Garden, that's a welcome sight to the area. And of course the McDonald family and what they've done along Union Street here with their businesses, the Stockade Inn and the Van Dyke. That's very, very interesting.
Has it lost some of the community by losing businesses?
I think what's really nice is that the family-owned homes are still, they're preserved. Many of the houses are very well preserved and restored because they have been family-owned. There's now been, now by direction and code, we cannot turn the houses into apartments and dwellings once they're, and I think that has given us the opportunity to keep some of the houses the way they are.
So that there was more community by having 2 businesses, more interaction of people in the past because you could go and talk to one another in these businesses. Like there's Arthur's.
Right.
The other with Leo the Butcher and the other stores.
Oh, it was great.
Was there much more community interaction?
It was great. It was just, there was constant traffic up and down Ferry Street.
Pleasant traffic, though.
Right. But even as you approach State Street, H.S. Barney Company, and next to them, of course, Mahoney's Hardware. You didn't have to venture very far to, it was almost like walking to a strip mall today.
You said H.S. Barney, and H.S. Barney started on the corner of Union and Ferry.
That was along the facade there, but that was predated 1900, right? I mean, long ago, and even in the 1800s, yeah.
That's when it started.
Mm-hmm. Oh, exactly. You knew, and not only that, but you had more of a feeling of, like even when you went to State Street on Thursday nights, you'd have to, as a child, you'd be bumping into people. There's tremendous traffic, and I mean, you're just going, not only the Carl Company, Wallace's, SS Kresge, and all the stores that were there. It was incredible.
But even down here, going to the stores, you could just run out and get something for dinner.
Oh yeah,
and get your hair done.
Yeah,
and just you could do small things here and there and meet your neighbors on the way.
That's right. Yeah, And you know, you'd walk into Kruger's and go back in the store, and you'd be shuffling through sawdust on the floor. Very typical of Meat Market. Same with Leo the Butcher's. Walk in there, and you'd smell the pine sawdust, and you just shuffle your feet right there. And as a kid, you're going to try to slide on a wooden floor with the sawdust and everything, but it was just great. And he was a great guy, good friend with my mom's. And then the same with the shoemaker, an old German fella, and he was an excellent shoemaker. And it was a nice experience down here, very, very much. And today, as you go there, there's a few remnants of stores and Pat's Grill, which is now Slick's, and the little side entrance in the back where the women were allowed to go in because it was basically referred to as a tap room. The beer on tap, the women were allowed to sit in the back room at tables and the men at the bar. And then next to that, Sam's Deli, the little Jewish fella there that had a small little deli there. And it was just, it was an area that as of today, there's still those little small continued businesses, the Moon River Cafe, where Mr. Vogel had the newsstand. That was, he'd sell penny candy in the bag, have all types of magazines and papers, and, if you wanted to go in and get a bottle of soda or something, and he had a business there for years. And